Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is broadcast 453, or the tape cassettes go out, 453. And I think it's August the 10th, 1980. I just want to cite two items that were in the newspaper today, rather unpleasant items, but apropos of what I've been trying to explain is going on in these broadcasts for the last 9 years. This was a meeting of the Ku Klux Klan in Montgomery, Alabama. They were demonstrating there, but this time, instead of just marching on the street, they were holding a coffin, an empty coffin, and it was supposed to be the body of Reverend Martin Luther King. It was a casket with signs about white power, and they had the march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama with the Imperial Wizard, Bill Wilkinson, and they had placards that said, "Here's what's left of your civil rights leader," a reference to Martin Luther King, killed in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. Inside the casket was a plastic skull that was visible through a small hole, and they took this march making fun of Martin Luther King. Here's your civil rights movement. In Galveston, Texas, the Klan was meeting also. They're training for the day that they can take over by force. This is from the San Francisco Examiner, the Chronicle, and they're practicing on a 50-acre plot. They said the racist control of California and the executions will begin within 10 years. They have a book called Turner's Diary that they recommend that the Klan members read. It's the Mein Kampf of the American Klan, and it explains how many people will have to be killed. They will bomb the FBI headquarters in Washington, and then they will take executions, tens of thousands of lampposts and power poles and trees throughout Southern California where grisly forms will hang. The corpses are decorated with placards that will say, "I betrayed my race, I defiled my race." The Turner Diaries is for sale, and it tells about field radios and ammunition. Their vehicles and uniforms are the khaki olive green because they may need National Guardsmen or Army troops coming in, and they will be disguised as the Army. They have grenades and food supplies and so forth. And one of the things that they said at the meeting in Montgomery, Alabama, is that they're going to teach Jimmy Carter to say nigger again, that he'll be back saying that within 10 years. The practice of the Klansmen is to prepare for the future for the decade when the United States will be destroyed internally. Racists will make their move. They will pass for National Guardsmen or Army troops whenever necessary. They will steal weapons, conduct sabotage, have hit-and-run attacks against the federal troops. These are just two states in today's news, but this goes continuously. I got a telephone call from a gentleman in New Jersey last week. He wanted to come out to Carmel, California to do some work and write an article about me, and I'm very careful to screen the people that come through, believe it or not. Very few to get into the house. And I asked him what he had done previously, and he told me that he had infiltrated the Ku Klux Klan in South Carolina. I said, "You must be a pretty tough bun to get into there and pass along with them and do their actions. And now you want to come to my house in California." He followed the phone call with a letter. It said, "Please send me biographical details about yourself, including why and how you got into this business. I also like your perspective for the college courses you've taught in the past. And please send your recent cassette on the Hoover Institute." I've enclosed 450. I'm sure I don't want that person coming from New Jersey to the home. Many of you people who have my past cassettes remember, and I've read it on the air before, maybe I should read it every week. It's the FBI report that was done about me in September 1967, many years ago, and this was to be disseminated to all of the agencies, the federal agencies of the United States, regarding the assassination of President John Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963, that I was a danger to this country and information should be disseminated about me immediately because I was concerned about fascism in the United States, and it even stated it publicly. I think I should begin the program with that every week as these hooded ones and these dangerous people begin to take over and infiltrate in every state and disguise themselves in the clothing of the National Guard and the Army, so you won't be able to tell the difference. There was a note in the Sunday paper in the parade section asking, how is it out of 220 million of the world's wealthiest, most educated, most advantaged people, the choice of the presidency comes to Jimmy Carter or Ronald Reagan? And the answer was, our political system favors men of relentless persistence and concentrated ambition, rather than Renaissance men of broad background and experience. And that was the very gentle explanation of how we select our presidents. In looking up some information for a future broadcast on Ronald Reagan, I came to notes that I had when I was on KLRB in 1976, August 16th. That was quite a few years ago, when a radio program, and I said at the time that Ronald Reagan was selected many years ago for the President of the United States, and that if he didn't get the nomination in 1976, he would get it the next time. And I said on that tape, no room at the top for Rockefeller, that Nelson Rockefeller is a manipulator of a different kind, but Ronald Reagan was selected by the Howard Hughes Corporation, the Pentagon, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the aerospace industries, the multinationals, the clandestine operations, and therefore he would have to receive the nomination of not in 1976, in 1980 for sure, because otherwise he's too old. And that's where Ronald Reagan sits today. I also mentioned last week that I would talk about Jack Anderson and the way he manipulates news and elections, and I will get to that in a minute. But there were some very important articles this week that I want to mention with you. I may not be able to go into detail on all of them, but they are on the newsstands now, and they're important. One is a description of a Mr. His name is Khashoggi. I used to call him Khashoggi, but if you remember Hogg, it's Khashoggi. It's regarding the divorce case of Khashoggi versus Khashoggi. This isn't exactly Kramer versus Kramer. And I bring it up because it's in the Sunday paper today. It was in a magazine called Los Angeles and also in the San Jose Mercury. And this story is similar to the Watergate story breaking this Mr. Khashoggi, the Saudi Arabian, is linked to Ronald Reagan and all the people that put Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan into office. And this divorce case threatens to be one where a lot of information will come out that is embarrassing to the entire aerospace entourage that manipulated the candidacy of Ronald Reagan and could eventually rub off an effect, along with 100 other scandals that the newspaper people are concealing. It could affect his presidency. If he's elected, the stories will just keep rolling out anyway. The 43-year-old wife of Mr. Khashoggi, his name is Adnan, her name is Soraya, wants $2.5 billion because she helped accumulate this fortune. They got a divorce. The author of the article, Sally Davis and Ivor Davis, described Soraya as a combination of Eva Peron, Imelda Marcos, and Marie Antoinette. The only name he left out was Jacqueline Onassis, the queen of them all. And we can do some tapes alone on Jacqueline Onassis. The attorney for Mr. Khashoggi is Joseph Ball. He was on the Warren Commission. He concealed the murder of John Kennedy. He's now representing a man whose entire fortune is in manipulating aerospace, the Lockheed, Litton Industry, Northrop, and other corporations which are not mentioned in the article. I'm curious to know what they are, but there also has to be blackmail and swindling and narcotics, international scandals at the highest level to accumulate the kind of fortune that he has in the last years. His attorney is from the Warren Commission. Joseph Ball also represented John Ehrlichman, one of the Watergate plumbers, in the lawsuit of Dr. Fielding's offices in Beverly Hills. And also Joseph Ball is in the law office in Beverly Hills of Ball, Hunt, Hart, Brown, and Brerowitz. The Brown being Pat Brown, the father of Jerry Brown. Just so you know where Jerry Brown stands, because besides Mr. Khashoggi being very much into the aerospace industry, the scandals, the prostitutes, the millions of dollars of jewelry handed out to these men's mistresses, and the setup of intrigue, of blackmail and weapons contracts between California and Saudi Arabia. The law office that represents these interests is the father of the governor of California, who has continuously pushed contracts for the space colonies, which also, they come out of California, Rockwell, Lockheed, and so forth. The scandal of Mr. Khashoggi goes from San Francisco down to Los Angeles, particularly, and it's coming out in this lawsuit. 1/3 of California money comes from arms and defense, military spending, and so forth. So he's a very important person, and his wife, Soraya, is threatening in this divorce suit to mention various people. Now, she says that she set up evenings and was in hot contact with the highest officials of Lockheed, of Litton Industry, of Northrop, as I say, and other corporations, that her job was, after the male procured the women, to set up pimping, pandering, bribery, corruption, threats of executions. There were secret Swiss bank accounts, $25,000 sweeteners to the wives and mistresses of the top California business executives. Now, all of these are Ronald Reagan's crew, so some of it eventually is going to rub off into the candidacy and the people and the cabinet that Reagan would appoint. Roy Ashe of Litton Industries was Office of Management Budget for Richard Nixon, and it was his office that funneled the Greek military junta and put the Nazis back in power, at least for a temporary time during one time when Richard Nixon was in office. It was also the Litton Industries that were the front for James Earl Ray, the patsy for the Martin Luther King assassination. He went to the Mississippi shipyards to pick up his money. Soroya says her duties were to pay a fleet of prostitutes that were brought to the party after they were collected. The parties were for various prominent California business executives, and there were politicians. Dispense with the jewelry, deliver it, and it was used for the bribery of American businessmen and kept their mistresses and executives going. And she feels that she created the fortune for Mr. Khashoggi, and she should get a share of it. When they started out, they didn't have much, and they built up this empire. Now, it's strange that a man like Khashoggi and all of those people behind the nomination of Ronald Reagan have been protected for so long. Because when you are a newspaper watcher, when you're a media person, reading People magazine and some of the slick literature for public consumption, the scene behind the scenes is lost, and we're watching the wrong people. We watched Aristotle Onassis and his cavorting around on his yacht, the Christina. Khashoggi has a yacht. He has two yachts, one a $44 million yacht and another yacht, airplanes with a communication system equal to Air Force One, 11 homes, California banking. He owns California banks, property in Palm Springs and Nevada and countries all over the world. When everybody was watching Nelson Rockefeller and the Trilateral Committee and the Council of Foreign Relations, nobody was watching the Stanford Institute, the cabinet that will be behind Ronald Reagan. And Nelson Rockefeller is dead, but Dmitri von Mohrenschildt and Heinrich Himmler and the Vesco, Khashoggi, Litton, Lockheed connections were very quietly kept by the media and protected, while Nelson Rockefeller was deep sixth and Onassis was deep sixth. And those were the media personalities we were watching. We weren't watching Daniel Ludwiganoff or Mr. Khashoggi and some of these people behind the scenes. He has banks in Liechtenstein, a company called the Triad Company, 15 banks in Northern California, hotels in Europe, Africa, Kenya, property in Salt Lake City, New Mexico, Nevada, industrial parks, trucking companies, investments in South Korea, Brazil, Saudi Arabia. And then he also, in his holdings, has what is described in the newspapers, hundreds of millions of dollars in court documents to have been paid to him by U.S. aerospace corporations. Now, whatever those are, I can't imagine, but this is part of his holdings. Now, according to this article in the newspaper today, Soroya is kicking up quite a storm, and she's causing commotion in the various homes and then the political scene in California. You don't get any of this at the Republican convention. All is sweet and wonderful, but the movers behind Ronald Reagan are very much involved in this story. Incidentally, Khashoggi was the son of a doctor in Saudi Arabia. His father was the doctor for King Ibn Saud. He was sent to Palo Alto and lived in Palo Alto, went to San Francisco State University for a year. There's a discrepancy in the years he spent in California under the Hoover Institute wings in Palo Alto, but he became what is known as the Saudi Arabian Arab connection to the California aerospace industries. He convinced the Saudis and the Middle East faction to arm and buy tracks and tractors and airplanes and weapons. He got the contracts for California and in turn was paid. He was the perfect go-between the lucrative bridge who accumulated billions of dollars of fortune on contracts arming the entire Middle East and using his influence through gifts, women, sex, and a fast tongue, and goodness knows what else, homes all over the world, to arm the Middle East to the hilt. and make sure that he got a piece of the action at both ends from Saudi Arabia and from the California institutions. So after World War II, this character moved to California and began, according to the very good scheme of the Borman Brotherhood, which is detailed in a book by William Stevenson, the arming of the Middle East. There were many Nazis. Hitler had close alliance with the Nazis in the Middle East, and the theme was to arm them and prepare them not only to wipe out Israel, but to take a strong position controlling the oil that so many countries were dependent upon. There was another article this morning in his newspaper about Mr. Gaddafi, and he was threatening the United States. There was no hidden message in his statements. He blamed the Billy Carter affair on political plot, that they were trying to get Jimmy Carter and bring him down and make it look like a big scandal. But then on the other hand, he had this to say, and this has to do with arming the Middle East, when I say that there was a very careful plan at the end of World War I to immediately arm the entire Middle East. Mr. Gaddafi said, Americans have assured me they don't believe in putting all their eggs in one basket, and they don't believe Libya is a Soviet base or any of that nonsense. America needs us in many ways, and these needs are growing year after year, alluding to the import of 650,000 barrels a day of Libyan oil, which is more than one-third of the oil production, 1.7 million barrels a day. Libya also imports from the United States, and those imports were up to $600 million. Gaddafi said that if the policy of the American president next year, that's Reagan or Carter, does not reflect a pro-Palestinian stance, we will use our oil as a political weapon, not only oil, but our trade with the United States. So the use of oil as a political weapon is being spelled out. He's saying this is silly to bring in Billy Carter. He's minute. You need us, and we're not going to trade from you. We can trade from other people, and whoever is the president, don't play around and don't use this as a political ploy. Whoever is the president will know that we will use our oil as a political weapon. It's very important to watch the manipulation of men like Khashoggi, who made these tremendous fortunes, arming the entire Middle East and preparing to wipe out Israel, with the California industrialists, the aerospace industry that brought many, many Nazis in Project Paperclip and afterwards to the United States with the same intents that the Ku Klux Klan had, but at a different, more sophisticated level. So the trial of Khashoggi versus Khashoggi is going to be taking place in the divorce courts. I doubt if she'll be able to get into the courts in the divorce case as much as she's saying now. She's writing a book, and the authors of this article said, Mr. Adnan Khashoggi, we are told, prays twice daily to Allah. He must occasionally include in those prayers a plea for someone to get rid of these uppity women. Now, many people are making plans, I'm sure, to get rid of that uppity woman, but they spelled it out, and I'm sure that maybe she will get the Dorothy Hunt or the Martha Mitchell treatment, because I assure you that the manuscript she's writing will probably never get printed, and the only thing we'll hear of it is what we read in the paper today. Martha Mitchell was writing a book. A book came out about Martha Mitchell, but it's not the real book that would have come out if she had been alive and been able to tell the whole story of Watergate. 3 weeks ago, tonight, I went back on KLRB, and I mentioned some very important news stories that I had been covering for the last 2 years to update you on certain tapes or radio programs that I had been doing continuously. While I'd been off this station, they were played on other stations. And primary on that list, I mentioned, was the arrest of Frank Turpel and George Kercola. And then last week, August the 3rd, there was an article about Billy Carter with Frank Turpel, the arms merchant, buying weapons in Libya, being seen with him in the bleachers with Gaddafi's men, entertained over there by Frank Turpel. Turpel working with Mr. Samuel Cummings from London, the arms merchant of the week. But I also mentioned that one of the main stories of the importance to follow are the Abscam arrests. The many arrests that the Justice Department are trying to take into effect, and primarily the arrest of Carlos Marcello and a man named Irv Davidson. Davidson lives in Washington, D.C., and Marcello is in New Orleans. Well, this week, wouldn't you know, there was an article about Billy Carter seen with Irv Davidson. Another person that I said was terribly important besides Frank Churchill was Billy Carter in the company of Davidson. And there was an article in the San Francisco Examiner, "The White House Failed to Tell Possible Billy Crime Link." This is sent from Chicago News and also the San Francisco Examiner. Lobbyist Irv Davidson may have put the president's brother in touch with the Libyans in the first place, the Chicago Tribune said. Billy Carter's Libyan ties were supposed to be business contacts. Irv Davidson is an important man with Georgia-based Coca-Cola Company. He represents the Indonesian Army, the Israeli Air Force, and Nicaraguan strongman Anastasio Somoza. Davidson is under federal indictment for fraud and conspiracy and worked along with crime boss Carlos Marcello and others. There was a meeting at Miami where Davidson made the contact of Billy Carter to the Libyans, and Davidson is under indictment right now for the Abscam scandal and for trying to get favoritism in the immigration offices for Carlos Marcello, who allegedly was to have been deported many years ago for a long list of crimes. I feel that using Billy Carter is, as Gaddafi says, a ploy to bring down Jimmy Carter at this time, because Irv Davidson is notorious in his links to George de Moranchill, to the Kennedy assassination, to Carlos Marcello, to the wheeling dealing in Washington. Why in the world would Irv Davidson take Billy Carter, that simpleton brother of Jimmy Carter, to meet Gaddafi, if it wouldn't be to the interest of various people to manipulate Jimmy Carter and get even with him for the arrest of Abscam? I mentioned that there's certain people in the crime syndicate that don't appreciate that the Carter administration has fingered Carlos Marcello and Irv Davidson to be arrested. It's the first time in their lives that they ever got embroiled in such a big scandal. And Irv Davidson was under wiretap for a year by the FBI. And certainly they would have told Jimmy Carter or Billy Carter, don't go to the party with Irv Davidson. We have him tapped and bugged with the crime figures around the country. But the Carters were not warned, and I feel that Rosalyn Carter was set up, photographed with Jim Jones and the Ippolito family and Gacy in Chicago, that they made a big thing out of her being photographed with all these mobsters, these leaders. We never saw Happy Rockefeller, Betty Ford, or Nancy Reagan, or any other of the first ladies with such notorious mass murderers. I mean, Jones with over 900 deaths, and Gacy with 32 or 40 deaths in Chicago, and the crime syndicate in New York City. We never saw any first ladies photographed in that kind of a compromising position before. There's usually a lot of research and detail done upon who they see before they're photographed or seen socially. So I believe that the meeting of Irv Davidson setting up Billy Carter and the mob getting into Billy Carter's contacts in Libya is a setup again to try to bring the Carter family into the news media. Not that they're perfect, and they certainly have enough problems, but I think there's a concerted snow job, which, as I mentioned last week, I've seen for a long, long time, and I think it's important to know that there can't be 20 people introducing Billy Carter to the Libyan government. I also mentioned the importance of the John Kennedy assassination and following the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And there was another article in the paper this last week on Billy Carter with the head of one of the members of Permindex. Permindex was the organization that set up the John Kennedy assassination, the attempted assassination on Charles de Gaulle that arranged the murder of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. And there was an article in Solidarity, how the mafia made Billy a Libya agent, and it goes into Michel Papa, the notorious drug dealer and terrorist who controls the Mediterranean drug dealing and narcotics operation, and how they introduced him to Mario Lianza in Atlanta, Georgia, and they set up a contact with Gaddafi in Libya. This article says in World War II and through 1950, the Sicilian government was closely associated with Lucky Luciano, which was true, this notorious member of organized crime who was wanted on a murder charge and was extradited to Italy, and then he was used by the U.S. OSS and then the CIA Office of Navy Intelligence. Lucky Luciano worked with Prince Spadafora, who became a member of the board of directors of Permindex, the operation that set up international assassinations all over the entire world. So in this past week, there was an article about Billy Carter with Irv Davidson, organized crime, who worked with assassination teams in the United States, and another article about Billy Carter working or being used by Permindex. Now, these assassination teams that are so notorious for killing the heads of states and the presidents have always killed those persons that were running in opposition to Richard Nixon or who would oppose Ronald Reagan. And another way to use Billy Carter possibly through these contacts would be if Jimmy Carter was close to the election. These assassination teams are useful, and they could get information about where he was or his movements through Billy Carter. If the Secret Service didn't help them innocently through his brother, they could get information. Billy Carter has said, and Rosalyn Carter said on television, that she doesn't talk to her family on telephone because they believe their line is tapped. If the president or his wife said, Billy, we're going to come down for Thanksgiving, we'll meet you at such and such a time, and you wanted to kill Jimmy Carter, there are many people who know where he is. But Billy Carter has these contacts with these various people from the assassination teams. He's photographed with Frank Turple, who has these assassination teams and works with Mitchell Werbell and the man who makes these silencers for the assassins, and Frank Corcola, who trains the assassins. Billy Carter is now linked to Permindex and the notorious narcotic gun-running assassination teams that killed so many people in the United States and around the world before. And now he's linked with Irv Davidson. So in the last week, poor Billy Carter's been shoveled around like a bag of peanuts, I guess. He certainly is out of his league. He was running a gas station and guzzling beer until his brother got in the White House. But they're using him. Robert Vesco said they're using him to bring down Jimmy Carter. Gaddafi says they're using Billy Carter to embarrass the administration. And it certainly seems that if Jimmy Carter's politics don't go down by the electoral process, if he seems close to winning the election, there are these many assassination teams surrounding the people around his brother. Now they want to make his brother a lobbyist for Gaddafi and a foreign agent, and then he has to declare where all of his money is, and they keep bringing the Carters down in a web that can be very hazardous to Jimmy Carter's life or to their future career or safety. I was looking, among other notes, besides finding the things I wrote or had on radio about Ronald Reagan in 1976, and I came across a tape I did on KLRB. This was August 15th, 1977. Just 3 years ago, it was tape number 282. We're up to 453 now. And I mentioned on that program about political assassins and how dangerous the subterfuge is for these assassinations. And I referred to a man named Jim Jones, who had a People's Temple in San Francisco, who ran a training school for political assassinations, and that he could get patsies to be blamed for political assassinations. And I mentioned that people are hypnotized, church members were forced to sign confessions for killing the President of the United States or for overthrowing the government when they didn't do it. So that Jones in 77 was training people to admit to assassinations that could be used in the future. That was in 1977, taken from the San Francisco Chronicle. And these confessions and slips, unsigned or with people's names on that we don't know, can still be used. And the Carters are surrounded by a very dangerous team and one not to be taken lightly. It's half hour, it's 30 minutes of this program, World Watchers, and we're going to take a break for about 30 seconds because we make a cassette of this tape each week, and we're going to turn that cassette over. The 1 hour tapes are too thin and don't work very well, so we're going to take a break now and let you think about that news of the half hour before we pick up some speed on the next half hour.
Okay, thank you. We'll be right back with Mae in just a moment.
All right, you ready for another half hour of news of political assassinations and conspiracies? One of the letters I received last week or several weeks ago is, have you considered communicating with Jack Anderson regarding the information you have found. She referred to some information I had on KGO last week. I was on the air with Bob Trevor, and she wanted me to get this to President Carter and reach Jack Anderson. And it's interesting I got that letter because when I went off the air last week with you, I was talking about the importance of the news and the way the news manipulators swing our minds around and keep so many of the important events and facts I share with you each week off of the major news stations, or they refer to them as isolated events and don't make connecting links so that you can see the picture or structure coming together. It takes a special kind of mind to relate these events as they flow, to see a pattern of whether it's assassinations or cover-ups or concealing the facts in the news. There's an article by Kevin Starr in the San Francisco Examiner this Sunday referring to that book that I mentioned when I came back on KLRB, Without Fear or Favor, by Harrison Salisbury. And this article by Kevin Starr is similar to what I was trying to say to you before about the news media covering up the facts and not allowing us to have the full truth, and how the New York Times specifically, Salisbury writes in his book, kept the newspaper, the New York Times, as a branch of the federal government, starting with its ownership in 1896, that Mr. Ox believed, Adolph Ox, that the New York Times should belong to the Wall Street establishment and to the White House. He thought that was the patriotic thing to do. And Harrison Salisbury said that the government had three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial, and also newspapers. And the book, Without Fear or Favor, claims that after 1971, the New York Times broke with the White House and decided to print the Pentagon Papers and not go along with what the White House ordered them to do. What he doesn't mention, I haven't read the book, but what he doesn't mention in this article, that one of the turning points might be the assassination of John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers, and the continuous murder of civil rights leaders. I mean, we could just give a list of them for 1 hour. Maybe they caught on that it was dangerous to go along with everything the White House was doing. And so in 1971, they broke and decided to print the story of the Pentagon Papers. The main point that I want to make about this article is that the United States is not governed by these four branches: legislative, executive, judicial, and the news media. It's governed actually by five branches, and that changed in 1947 after World War II. The fifth branch is actually the intelligence system, the network of the National Security Agency, the National Security Council, Navy Intelligence, NASA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and the Defense Industry Security Command. Those intelligence agencies, and you can throw in the FBI also, which got a lot of muscle after World War II when we began to rearm against Russia the third time around and feared coexistence with the Soviet Union and what would it do to our labor movement or our lifestyle in the United States and how it eat into profits. And the panic took place in this country that, what, my goodness, if we have to live with the Soviets, we may become like them, and they will try to change us so that we become like they are and change the capitalistic system and get rid of the extremes of poverty and the extremes of wealth. So the intelligence network was set up in 1947, started in 1945. In 1947, it was firm. Under Harry Truman, he created the Central Intelligence Agency and then said when he resigned or left office, he had created a Gestapo, a monster. And it was President Eisenhower who warned us about the military intelligence. But the intelligence agency decides under the guise, in quotes, of national security what the newspapers will print, and they also instruct the legislative, the executive, judicials. They put money behind the elections of congressmen. They put in certain batch of them starting in 1946, 47, getting ready. Those were the years when Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and a whole group came into power in Congress and stayed there ever since. Many of them are still there. Not too many, but a few. But the point is that the agencies, the security agencies, took over and instruct the president what's good for national security, what he has to do, what his moves should be based, in quotes, on national security. And national security is always anything that has to do with what the Russians are doing or what we have to do to oppose them. In terms of news media, one of the men or the giants of the news media cover-up, in addition to what Harrison Salisbury is talking about, the New York Times and the major printed press, and then he goes on to say that all radio and television is regulated by the federal government, ABC, NBC, CBS. In addition to that, you get your columnists or your so-called muckracker like Jack Anderson, who was born in Long Beach and was served in the war in the Merchant Marine and then went to Washington. He moved into Drew Pearson's office in 1947. That's the year the Central Intelligence Agency was formed, and he took over Drew Pearson's files when Pearson died in 1969, after that rash of murders in the United States, that whole series of activists and so forth, and during the anti-war movement. Jack Anderson took over Drew Pearson's desk, and he has very carefully filtered the news of what he wants to have you believe. He tells you the truth, but he only tells you part of the truth, and sometimes he even outright lies. He's rented offices in Washington, D.C. from Irv Davidson from the Defense Department. Irv Davidson was in the defense and still could be. He's a gentleman who has threatened, if he's arrested, to tell everything that's going on in Washington, as McCord threatened to burn every tree in the forest. Irv Davidson has threatened if the government touches him on this arrest, he'll really start spilling the beans. He's one of the many people who's threatening blackmail the United States government at the time. Jack Anderson worked with Irv Davidson and rented from him. He worked with Frank Sturgis of the Kennedy assassination. He was heavily involved with very many people in the multiple assassinations, and never in his news story until just about a month ago even covered a whisper that there was a conspiracy on the Kennedy assassination. Irv Davidson, the fellow that rented to Jack Anderson and Drew Pearson, just threatened, this was April this year, if I get knocked out of the box, it's going to hurt this country. Sometimes the interests of the United States require certain things that, because of their shaky nature, cannot be identified with the United States. I told the FBI to don't play super agent with me. I have 2 passports. I'm dealing with National Security Council night and day. He rented the office space to Drew Pearson and Jack Anderson and was very familiar with them. Jack Anderson can talk about Dita Baird, the ITT memo. He can talk about Richard Nixon. He will not talk about the way power moves in this country and the links, for example, of Robert Vesco to Ronald Reagan. And I'll do other tapes later when I just talk about Ronald Reagan, about William Casey and Richard Allen, the war hawks for Ronald Reagan, and their deep implication with Robert Vesco, the international swindler of hundreds of millions of dollars. Jack Anderson hits at the Carters very selectively, but he avoids the other side. He's a Mormon. He's similar to there's a lot of Mormons around the Howard Hughes organization, Senator Paul Lazold, and the tribe, the Mormon Mafia, they were called, around Howard Hughes, selected Lazold for president, but if not president, the man behind Ronald Reagan, and he's running his campaign now. And Jack Anderson, as I mentioned before, is a business partner, was of Madame Chenault of the Flying Tigers, who they've put Gerald Ford on their board of directors. So Jack Anderson is a typical newspaper man who gives one side of the story and moves the candidates and shakes them around, but never comes out with the hard facts that would enhance our life or keep us out of some of the conditions that we keep getting deeper into that are leading us towards nuclear war. Jack Anderson did have an article April the 2nd, just a short article, interestingly enough, the first he's ever admitted, in which he wrote, this is called Kennedy Probe, and I had it on a tape 437, but I want to repeat it for the KLRB listeners. He said, while Abscam and Briar Lab scandals have been making headlines, the FBI is quietly digging into another assignment, the assassination of John Kennedy. The House Assassination Committee turned over to the Bureau its findings that Kennedy was probably killed as a result of a conspiracy, contrary to the conclusion of the Warren Commission 16 years ago. The FBI have been talking to former committee aides, seeking guidance for the use of their files in the archives and asking authors of some of the studies for the locations of other documents cited in their footnotes. They have come to a conclusion there was a fourth shot fired at Kennedy that day in Dealey Plaza. Now, in 17 years, that is all Jack Anderson has said about the Kennedy assassination. But he did something very interesting that I want to mention to you this evening to show you the way Anderson operates. In the San Jose Mercury, also today, in the parade section, he has an article, The Life and Trials of Carlos Marcello. And he brings up the fact that Carlos Marcello has been indicted under the Abscam investigation. The FBI undercover sting operation recently caught on tape an assortment of conniving congressmen, but he said the most startling catch-all was a 70-year-old grandfather from a quiet New Orleans suburb, Carlos Marcello. And Anderson said, after months of investigation, I've pieced together little pieces about Marcello. Now, Carlos Marcello and Irv Davidson have worked hand in glove through the entire assassination era, and Jack Anderson has worked along with these people, protected them, and I wondered, what in the world would Jack Anderson write about Marcello 17 years after the Kennedy assassination and hushing this entire crime and all the other murders up continuously? As long as Marcello is indicted, what's he going to say about his buddy or their co-workers? What could Jack Anderson say? The one valuable thing in the article is that he has a chart of the National Crime Syndicate Commission, Organized Crime in America, with all the main crime families from Louisiana, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, New York, the Gambinos, the Bonanos, the Genoveses, the Luccheses, the Colombos, and so forth, the Angelo, Brunos. He has a crime chart, but that doesn't have anything to say about Carlos Marcello. But he goes into a few past things that Marcello has been arrested for and got off the hook. But then Jack Anderson pulls a nice one. He writes about him nothing important, nothing about Abscam or why he's indicted or his links to Irv Davidson or the assassinations. He says, Carlos Marcello lives in a 3-bedroom house at 3908 Clifford Drive in New Orleans in the suburb of Metairie. Remarkably, it's located on an exposed corner lot. It's easily accessible to passerbys. There's no high stone walls or electric fences, no security alarms or watchdogs or armed guards protecting the property. He drives to the office either in his Lincoln or his Cadillac, the headquarters of a modest 5-room near shopping complex, so forth. He says he goes to lunch at a certain restaurant next door where some of his brothers may join him, and it describes that he has a plantation in the bayou where he has secret underworld meetings. Now, considering that Jack Anderson for 17 years has protected by not exposing or mentioning the interlocking links of these assassins and the Kennedy assassination, and now he admits this Kennedy assassination is going further in its investigations, and it could rub off on these very people that have been the wheelers and dealers of the news media and of politics in Washington, D.C. and in their home states. Jack Anderson prints the address, the habit, where he lives. He tells you there's nobody at the property. He walks to his car. He gets up early in the morning. Now, if that isn't an instruction to kill Carlos Marcello, I've never seen or heard one. Not that it matters. Carlos Marcello, he goes on to say, makes $2 billion a year in gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and other criminal undertakings. The criminal undertakings are the extortion and the blackmail for having worked with David Ferry and Clay Shaw and the syndicate and the world Nazi links of Permindex in the murder of John Kennedy, and the role that Marcello played in the New Orleans area with a man that impersonated Lee Harvey Oswald in the New Orleans area, and also meeting with Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, in this article, Anderson doesn't mention David Ferry and Marcello. He doesn't say that Marcello not only is indicted in Amscam, but was suggested as being a possible assassin playing a role in the assassination of John Kennedy. In April, he admitted the Kennedy story is going to break open. Later, the Marcello indictment comes, and he's arrested for the Abscam. Now, Jack Anderson gives you his address and his habits. If you know the habits of other people involved, such as Robert Hall, who was involved with Ronald Reagan and Vesco and Howard Hughes' affair, he was shot in his kitchen with, he'd gone to the refrigerator and was shot through the window and killed. He had 3 cherries in his mouth. That's always a description of his murder. Sam Giancana was killed in his home at the refrigerator. John Roselli was cut up and put in a drum and was found floating outside of Florida. All these people worked on the assassination teams with Robert Mayu and the Hughes organization. And Carlos Prios Shikero was shot. DeMoranchil was shot through the mouth, and everyone involved. Jimmy Hoffa was put in a presser, a car presser, and his body was never seen again. These mobsters and the intelligence agents that worked with the mobsters on the Kennedy assassination were most of them done in. William Harvey, and the only few left are Carlos Marcello and Santos Traficanta, and also James Angleton and Richard Helms. Those 4 are, and Robert Mayu. There are other people involved with the underlings, but these are the biggies, and Marcello is one of the biggies because of his link to the World Nazi Organization and organized crime and the syndicate and gun running and various crimes for the past years, 50 years. He's been watched, in quotes, watched by the intelligence community while he carried on his $2 billion a year operation. As I said before, while the news media watched Onassis, they didn't watch Khashoggi very well, or Khashoggi. While they were watching Howard Hughes, they called him the billionaire, the crazy billionaire with $2 billion, and watched his yacht. Didn't watch Onassis close enough, watched Hughes. It never came to the attention of many magazines that Carlos Marcello is making $2 billion a year, much more than Howard Hughes ever had with all the oil drills and oil bits and aerospace. $2 billion a year, Carlos Marcello. That's an awful lot of swindling and prostitution, narcotics, blackmail, and so forth. So Jack Anderson, who's worked with this gang, protected them, rented from them, known them personally, gives the address, the habits, the hour he wakes up, the cars he drives, and just about tells you, go on and get him. Here's, if you want him, go get him. Angelo Bruno was another important organized crime figure from Philadelphia who was linked to Samuel Cummings and Turpel and Corkella, who was blown away the very week of the Abscam arrests. Now, in conclusion, in the last 10 minutes, I want to call attention to an article I hope those of you who get these tapes next week will be able to obtain, or did get off the stands, the Globe newspaper. The Globe is a small newspaper like the National Enquirer or the Star. It's been out for years. It used to be called the Midnight Globe, and I, for a while, did quite a few articles for them. They came out with their front page story this week. Onassis had JFK killed and many others slain. And there's a list of people that John Kennedy was one of them. John Kennedy murder, the Robert Kennedy murder, how Onassis was murdered, Oswald's murder, Chappaquiddick, the murder of Pope Pius XI, J. Edgar Hoover's murder, Lyndon Johnson's murder, Martin Luther King's murder. You can order this book, and I'll have a sheet of bibliography for those of you that send for it, where you can order this book. You can write to me, and I'll give you the name of this book. It comes out of California, Lake Tahoe. And the author of this book that the Globe is talking about, his name is Mr. Renzo. He works for the Central Intelligence Agency, and he's publishing the book of the Gemstone Files. And many of you are familiar with the Gemstone Files, and some of you don't know about them. Bruce Roberts wrote the Gemstone Files. I first met Bruce Roberts in 1972 when I wrote Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped? It was published by Paul Krasner in The Realist in August of 72. And around, I guess November, not much later than November or August, I was on KGO radio talking about Martha Mitchell and the CIA behind the Watergate and Richard Nixon behind Watergate. And I got a letter and a phone call from a Bruce Roberts. And he called me a few times. I met him in San Francisco. And he put in my hands the entire Gemstone file. It's 400 pages. And he made allegations about these various murders, how Kennedy was murdered, and the role of Aristotle Onassis in these murders. And it was a chronology of the life of Onassis, the Greek drug pusher selling opium and hashish in Argentine, his work with Joseph Kennedy and Meyer Lansky, and working up the links of Onassis to Nelson Rockefeller, the Rockefeller family, and Onassis buying Liberty ships, and how he kidnapped Howard Hughes and took over the entire Howard Hughes empire. As I say, I had 400 pages of the manuscript, and I kept it. I studied it for quite a few years, and in 1974, I wrote an article for Playgirl with Stephanie Caruana called Is Howard Hughes Dead and Buried Off a Greek Island, with the allegations that Onassis had indeed taken the original Howard Hughes. At the time, Bruce Roberts said it was Mr. Rector, Wayne Rector, the double, but later Vance Cooper surfaced and said, I think it was Rector who surfaced later, said, no, I wasn't the person. Vance Cooper was the man who was kept as the double, and he's buried in Howard Hughes' grave. I took that part of the story of the Gemstone File and published that and sat on some of the other information and have used part of it, but not all of it, in the last years. And often people call and write, ask me about the Gemstone File. Maybe if I have time next week, I'll do an analysis. 1/3 of what the Gemstone File says, I believe, checking it out, is true. As far as I can tell, I've had it 8 years and read many, many books and articles on these stories to check them out. It seems to be true. About 1/3 of it is not true, and 1/3 of it can't be proven either way yet. Some of it is false information. It's disinformation. It's interesting that the Gemstone Files got in the hands of the Central Intelligence Agency, and they want to make a movie. They said that a company is going to make a movie on the Gemstone File. Republic Picture Corporation and Fighting Tigers, this is a subsidiary of Air America, the Central Intelligence Agency, are putting up the money to make a movie on the Gemstone Files. Now, it's going to be difficult to do some of that. Of course, they claim that John Rosselli did the fatal headshot to John Kennedy. Because John Rosselli's dead, you can say anything. And they talk about the role of Onassis in the murder, knowing and planning the murders of John Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and using Lyndon Johnson as a puppet. I would like to take those points and go over them with you at some other time and analyze them with you at length. The first thing that he told me, one of the things he told me in the Gemstone File, was that the Pope, Montini, was in the OSS at the Vatican, and the OSS, which was the American Intelligence System, and the CIA became all one, that the Vatican was a branch of the Central Intelligence Agency. Bruce Roberts told me that in 1972. Just this last week, there was an article in the Washington Post by Thomas O'Toole, Prize World War II Spy Story in the Vatican. And it tells about a man who worked for the OSS, who was placed in the Vatican by James Angleton of Counterintelligence. And he began writing articles from the Vatican and then was employed by the CIA later. And this information that he was sending through James Angleton was false information to President Roosevelt and to President Truman. And he was lying, and the State Department knew that the reports coming out of the Vatican through James Angleton to the presidents of the United States were false reports. This article says that 2 presidents, Roosevelt and Truman, died not knowing that the Vatican files that they were reading were false, but the intelligence community knew them. The writer's name was Scatolini, and he was a one-time writer for pornographic plays, that figures, and became a writer for the Vatican. They have the world's best collection of pornography in the Vatican. He was a writer for the Vatican and a writer for the CIA, placed there by James Angleton, and sent false information to the presidents of the United States. And later, they buried his information somewhere in Maryland. It was buried and dug up. The files were dug up, and they were unearthed around 1960 of the links of the CIA and the OSS in the Vatican. And one of the reasons that they brought this story out now is that somebody, through the Freedom of Information, sent for facts on the OSS and the Vatican. But as soon as this author, who worked for the United States government and wrote for the Vatican, was unearthed, they put him in prison and claimed that he was put in jail, and they discredited him and said he was sending false documents. But what he was doing during an election in 1948 in Italy was spreading stories about the Vatican. And what the Gemstone File was the exchange of information of people who knew what was going on. In exchange for money, facts and blackmail became more expensive and powerful than even gems. And secretaries were given gems or false gems made by IG Farben, synthetic gems, in exchange for information, and information was peddled and blackmail was peddled. So the writer for the Vatican worked for the OSS and CIA, deceived the President of the United States. The CIA knew it, so that some of the things that Bruce Roberts turned me on to a long time ago that I continued to read and collect were in fact true. Now, before I finish, we just have about 2 minutes. I want to say that the information that I give you on these broadcasts, whether it's on the Klan or Jack Anderson's mentioning the Kennedy assassination, any material that I have during this hour is available on a printed sheet. If you want to send for it once a week or every 4 or 5 weeks, if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope with enough postage to cover the weight of the papers, I will send you the printed sheets with sources of information of where I'm getting material, such as the CIA and the Vatican and events that are taking place. I no longer, I don't like to hear people say, this is too incredible, where does she get her information? For the cost of a self-addressed envelope and 10 cents, you can see where I get my information, and you can share it yourselves. One other thing, the cassettes going out, we're having trouble with the subscribers because they're tested at the tape center here in Carmel, and they go out clear. Some people that receive them are complaining that they're hearing other programs. We're going to have to knock out the bottom of the cassette, because if you receive these, you buy them and receive them, and then somebody plays over them, they're sent back to us with programs that we don't know where they're coming from. And the only way to solve that, unfortunately, is to knock out the bottom of the tape, and you won't be able to erase it, but then you'll have these tapes for all times, and that's important. If you want, I'll give you a bibliography of the books on Howard Hughes. I studied the Gemstones file, as I said, for many, many years. I still study parts of it, and I will do an analysis for you. But if you are out on the stands and can buy the Globe and keep their version of it, it would be interesting. Bruce Roberts died of a brain tumor several years ago. He was angry that I didn't use more of the material that he had given to me, but I had no way of checking it out any faster than I was using it. And I didn't want to get myself involved with lawsuits and give disinformation of something I couldn't prove. I'll let the Globe do that or other publishers, but I have to be a little more cautious. Well, this is Mae Brussell. Our time is up. It's another hour. We'll have another week together on KLRB next week. Save your newspapers, articles on the draft, mind control, pollution, assassinations, intrigue, and look a little closer. You'll see there's an awful lot of news there that people are missing. Save your newspapers, maybe a month or 2 months even, and go back and get those articles after you hear my explanation of some of these events, and hopefully maybe you see them in a different light, because a lot of good stories are being lost by not being interpreted right from the beginning to see what we're being told, such as the Klan telling you what they're going to do 10 years from now. That's like Hitler's Mein Kampf. Don't take it lightly. Study it. See who's publishing these books. Write to the FBI and protest this kind of activity. That's all for tonight. Time is up. This is Mae Brussell. You take care. Till next week.
Thank you, Mae. Mae Brussell will be back next Sunday at